Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. My name's Adam Gearey. I'm here tonight to hopefully tell you a little bit about the LLM in international economic law, justice and development. I'm going to, for the most part, talk about the structure of the course, the content of the course, and why you might want to do the course. But I think it's worth outlining at the beginning that you can also do this course intensively if you so desire. If anybody's interested in going into that in more detail, I will. But at this point, I really just wanted to point that out. The way in which we can communicate is that you can type questions to me as we go along, and I will endeavour to answer them. If I can't answer them, I will get back to you. So with this, maybe something of a monologue, but if we have input from people out there, then it may become something more of a dialogue. Let's just see what happens. So to go back to my opening comments, I think I want to say a little bit about the structure of the course, the content of the course, the kind of people that do the course, and I suppose tell you a little bit about the history of the course. So perhaps it's logical for me to start with that starting point. I was one of the original team that set up this course a fair few years ago. Some people find the title a little bit long, let's say. But I think we've stuck with it for so long because it is a description of the multiple perspectives on this course. And I think it's also a good way really of thinking about why this course is perhaps different from other kinds of LLMs or MAs that are out there. And that is, it brings together these three concepts: international economic law, the theory of justice, the practice of justice, and the idea of development. And I suppose whatever else this course is about, it's an attempt to set up, if you like, a field where each of these terms is defined and comes into tension with the others. The idea being that this will allow us a more profound understanding of this already quite complex and fraught area. It's easier perhaps for me, first of all, to say some things about what the course is not. There are, of course, many courses in development at university, for instance, SOAS, the LSE. They are, of course, entirely focused on development. I think the one at SOAS, for instance, is an C rather than an LLM. They are very practically orientated. The difference between that kind of way of studying development and what we are doing here is, well, if I go back to this idea that we're thinking about the problem of development, I think it is a problem, through a political idea, a set of political ideas. This idea of justice, for instance, could be understood in part as a political term. It's also a moral term. It's a necessarily, I think, problematic term. It's a provocation. Clearly nobody would want to be unjust, but to ask questions of justice in relation to development and indeed international economic law seems to me not only an important starting point, but an important way in which one can then go on to think about institutions, practices, actors, actions, policies, international relationships. In other words, all the material, the themes that tend to constitute this field of study. International economic law is another disputed term. There are many books written on it. There are many different definitions of it. We can certainly say there are certain things that fall within the core of international economic law, such as the law as it relates to the WTO, the law as it relates to the IMF, the UN, the idea of human rights law. Perhaps that would, again, that body, a plastic body of law, I don't think there's any single definition, which to my mind is what makes this interesting. We can make claims about the relationship of legal concepts to political ones, to economic ones, to even moral ones, because I think I have to keep coming back to the point that the understanding of justice, the idea of justice, is a philosophical idea, an idea that comes out of moral philosophy. And so the assertion here is that we need to think about economic phenomena through these perspectives. We need to ask moral questions about economy. What do I mean by that? Well, think of poverty. Poverty is immoral, in my opinion. It's a degradation of the human being. Anything that degrades the human being and the environment in which the human being lives is unjust, immoral. And I think I want to start from that position. I don't think this is about moral subjectivism or relativism. I think this can be substantiated in the way that any claim in social science can be substantiated. So the desire to talk in terms of morality is really a question of how we think about economy. So this is clearly not a kind of claim to economy that might be made in more conventional terms. I'm not saying that one rejects those, but I'm saying that the important starting point is not to study either law or economy in a vacuum, and to ask difficult questions of these fields from a political or moral position that is not one of relativism, but one that can be defended. So that's I suppose, the way in which I think of this course. Obviously, my other colleagues who teach on this course, for instance, Professor Macmillan, I think would agree with some of those points, perhaps disagree with others. Professor Macmillan teaches, of course, focused primarily on institutions, the WTO, for instance. I'm not going to talk too much about what Professor Macmillan does because I'm not an expert, nor am I really capable or able to talk about a lot of the options on the courses because they are taught by other people. Obviously, I can outline them to you, and I think that's probably the better use of our time. But suffice to say, just for a moment, that the part of the course I teach, I suppose, reflects those ideas I've just been outlining to you. And obviously I could go into more detail and will go into more detail if time allows. So let me just step back for a moment from that description of the content or the idea, a general idea of the content or the direction, the trajectory of the course, and say a little bit about its structure. In terms of the way the course works, it's organised around a core. First part of the core, there's two parts of the core. One part is taught by Professor Macmillan, the other part is taught by me. That then engages with institutions and accounts of development in the way that I guess I've been talking about. There are then various options that you can add to that core. The options are listed in the prospectus. Again, it might be worth me overviewing them if people want me to. I'm not really there are descriptions in the prospectus. I'm not sure how useful it would be for me just now to go through each one of them. I'll wait and see if there's any questions on that. But it depends what you're interested in. If the question is, well, what options should I do? Well, look at the list of options and see which ones cohere most neatly with the kinds of things that you want to study. For instance, you may already have your own personal trajectory. You may be, I don't know, phenomenally interested in human rights or equality or climate change, in which case the answer's quite straightforward. Do those options. You may not. I mean, not everybody comes to these courses with that level of personal commitment or engagement with a certain set of themes, in which case one can choose, one can follow one's interests. And I think both of those approaches are completely fair enough. The bottom line for me with any form of study, but I think it's true of an LLM or an MA, a higher degree MSc, however you want to label them, is to enjoy it, to see this as a chance to engage intellectually with a subject for whatever reason you want to. Some people do this out of pure interest. That's a great reason. Other people do it for career reasons. That was also a good reason. I guess the other primary grouping would be that people are looking perhaps for direction towards a PhD or for further study. And so I think the reasons for doing the course might fall into one of those or one or other of those three boxes. An LLM then is, in some terms, a kind of bridge to a PhD, but it's also a freestanding qualification as well. It's clearly a step further than your first degree. It's a specialization. I suppose we have some people here who have developed interests in let's say, economic justice or development, what have you, during their law degree. It may be that you develop those interests, or you come across stuff that's interested you in whatever degree you studied first of all. And certainly there's no requirement that one has a law degree. Here we are a broad church, as you might guess from the description of the course content. It's not a black letter law course. By that I mean we are not focused exclusively on statutes and case law and international provisions. Obviously, to the extent they are relevant, we will talk about them. But I think that the energy of this course is more pitched at how we think about these things. Clearly, law is incredibly important in structuring the social world, the political world. So that's why we are a law school, and that's why this is an LLM. But it's certainly not a course narrowly focused on what I guess scholars call black letter law. In other words, law studied simply as law, divorced from any broader context. The course is not a distance learning course. It remains in some ways quite an old school course focused on face-to-face teaching. It's normally 2 evenings a week, 3 evenings a week. It depends a little bit on what your portfolio of courses looks like. By that I mean what options you choose. The teaching takes place in the evening between 6 and 9, and we're organised around 3 terms. The third term tends to be an examining term, so really the primary input, the primary time that you'll probably find yourself working are those first 2 terms, which run roughly from very late October, early September through to Christmas, then Christmas through to Easter. That's really where the bulk of the work takes place, the face-to-face work. And that third term is a lot lighter. There's obviously a lot going on in the law school. There's a lot of extracurricular stuff going on, including things like law on trial, reading groups, things like that. So it's hopefully a fairly dynamic place to be. The assessment, I think it's important to note, is not like a first degree. There are no exams on this course. For my personal philosophy, I'm not sure exams are appropriate for this level of study, or other places have exams. Some people like exams, some people loathe them. The form of assessment here is primarily focused on writing on essays of varying lengths. There is a possibility to do a dissertation, which clocks in, I think, 10,000 words. The way in which the core is examined, certainly my part of the core is examined, is a 4,000 word essay, so it's a lot shorter. I think it's fair for me to say then that the assessment method here tends towards the writing of essays, and perhaps one of the key things you might want to think about if you're wondering whether to do this course or not is your skills in this area. Obviously, we can skill you up here. And the other thing I think is that there's going to be a gap of time between perhaps applying for the course and the course starting in October. So one of the things you might want to think about is working on the way that you write, because clearly it is very important for the way in which the course is assessed. In-house, we have learning support officers. They can help you. But I think one of the things with writing is to link together reading and writing. Once said to me, you can always spot an academic on holiday, because instead of just reading a book, they've got a pencil, they're writing as they're reading. And I think there is a synergy between these two things. In other words, one more concrete point here is when you're reading, think about how the argument works, think about how the sentences work, think about how the argument builds, think about how the writer is trying to persuade you of something, think about the way in which the writer is using evidence, think about the quality of the evidence that the writer is using. Is it propaganda? Is it false news? Is it properly sourced? If it's sourced, how good are those sources? I mean, not every source is as good as another, and clearly if we are concerned with social scientific data, we want to be using statistical data, or even qualitative data that is verifiable, that is not just, if you like, party political, but which comes from a source that is, as far as possible, attempting to represent the world as it is through whatever filter, statistical, in other words, quantitative or indeed qualitative. So all this, these just little tick list, I suppose, is relevant, I think, to make one a more critical reader, a more critical thinker. And I think that does then feed into the way in which one does think and read more generally, particularly in these politically fraught times. Let me say a little bit about some preliminary reading if you are indeed interested in dipping your toe in the water, because my guess is you have perhaps a few courses that you might be looking at. You might be thinking, well, which one do I do? I mean, I remember being in that situation myself, and I suppose the only way of finding out is trying to see what each course is like, the kind of stuff you'll be reading, the kind of thinking that you will be doing. For instance, if you are a hard-nosed positivist economist, I wouldn't do this course, but it's not about that. If you are a hard-nosed black-letter lawyer, I doubt I would do this course, because that is not what it's about. That could be helpful. If you're able to tick us off a list, that is as good as being ticked onto the list. I would rather that, wherever you go to do your degree, you are in a place which is intellectually conducive, and you're not kind of going against the flow, if you like. So I think that's an important general set of considerations. But let me just say a little about some books that I think have been useful in my understanding of how this field fits together, and they feed into the course. And even if you're not interested in doing the course, I think there'd be books that are certainly worth reading. One of my, increasingly I use this book all the time, so here it is if you need the physical evidence, Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation. Strictly not a book on development, but the subtitle, I suppose, might give us a lead in into why it might be relevant for our area of thinking. The political and economic origins of our times. Okay, so that might be the reveal. What Polanyi is talking about is the creation of markets and global markets, and I suppose the consequences of that. It's a book written some time ago. It's really reflecting on the world up until about the Second World War. It's clearly not then a contemporary text, but I think Polanyi's writing on economy and on society and the relationship between the two is, I think, sharp. I think it remains incredibly worth working with, especially the idea of the double movement, which is developed primarily in relation to the time frame that Polanyi is talking about, crudely the way in which markets, or the desire to marketize, to commoditize, are met by what he calls a double movement, a response from society to those engagements or those economic events, such as the creation of trade unions, such as the creation of the welfare state. In other words, the market expands, but given the political will, social or political forces contend with that. Polanyi's argument being that left to its own devices, the market will destroy itself. The only way you get a functioning market is extremely crudely if it's a regulated market. Those seem to me still incredibly potent, worthwhile ideas. I'm at the moment reading Polanyi alongside the Egyptian Marxist Samir Amin. His book, The Law of Worldwide Value, is also well worth having a look at. You can, in fact, if you do a Google search if you want. There's enough traces of it online to give you a flavour of what this book is about. It's clearly Marxist. Polanyi was not a Marxist. It's a different reference point. It's expanding Marx. I think that Amin has a very, very interesting way of conceiving of what Marx was trying to do and how that might be used in a contemporary sense to think about whether you want to call it the developing world or the global north, the global south, whatever nomenclature you want to use. Amin uses a more Marxist vocabulary. He prefers to talk about imperialism. The idea of the Marxist concept of value, or indeed global value, is what Amin is using to rethink the Marxist canon. For me, I'm not saying that that Amin and Polanyi are saying the same thing. They're not. They're saying quite different things. But they are both very provocative thinkers. The third thinker for me, again, I'm not trying to say that you can combine these people. You can't. I think they have very, very different trajectories. what I'm saying is I have found in these different books really useful ideas. Amartya Sen's book, there's many, Development and Freedom is certainly worth looking at, but this text, quite easy to get hold of, a Penguin book. The idea of justice is, I think, key in its field, and certainly one of the themes that I reference to in the course is Polanyi's thinking of capacity and functioning. I think that's a very good way of thinking about what is valuable, what our possible conception of development might work. Clearly, again, there are tensions between Sen and the others, but I'm not going to go into that at the moment. A book that I've used in the past, Benjamin Selwyn's The Global Development Crisis, different reference point altogether, clearly more focused on this notion of development, book written within the last 5 or so years. I think it's a great place to start from. Certainly, Selwyn's in discussion, in dialogue, if you like, throughout this book with people like Polanyi and Sen and Marx. Less so Amin, I think, but Selwyn's certainly worth reading. The other book I just want to draw your attention to is a great collection, the Post-Development Reader, edited by Majid Rahmana and Victoria Bawtry. That's the book. It's just a fantastic collection of essays, very, very wide ranging. I think if you bring together those 4 texts, I think you've got a great set of resources on which you can draw. There are, of course, others. I'm not going to try and be too definitive here or go into too much detail, because I don't really know how much time we've got or whether it would be a great use of time. The other ideas that I think might be worth just glossing over in relation at least to the structure of the part of the course I'm responsible to. I could give you perhaps a sense of how that thing works. As I mentioned right at the beginning, the first part of the core, this is, so remember the structure of the course is composed of a core, which has 2 parts. I'm talking now about the part that I teach. Professor Macmillan's part is focused more on international institutions with I think a kind of primary focus on the WTO. My part, of course, I think is more pitched towards general ways of thinking. I'm just noting here that I've got to talk about in the intensive course, which I will do before the end of this session. I'll come back to that and any other questions that might pop up here. In terms then of this second part of the core, the starting point is with this idea of what we mean by development and what we mean by post-development. And I suppose the starting point of that thinking is to take, it might be counterintuitive if you think of development as something that happens elsewhere, is to actually take the idea of the Industrial Revolution, the development of the modern state, if you like, as its paradigm. Then from that we can draw certain ideas about development that perhaps link it to the idea of modernity, the idea perhaps of markets, the idea of capitalism. There are other ideas as well, but the mix that I suppose we are focused on is this idea then of modernity equaling certain things, industrial development, for instance. I'm aware these are vague and rather general terms, but this is 10 weeks work and I'm trying to summarize it in 5 minutes. So there's going to be some generalities. I'm hoping I can just give you a sense of the way in which this stuff fits together. So we're really working from the general to the specific, a general idea then of the problem of development, taking as its reference point the idea of, well, what might a developed state be? And for me, the contradiction here, the big problem here is, and this is entirely obvious since 2008, how can a polity committed to a rather disastrous set of economic principles which effectively tank the world economy speak of development? There's a certain amount of ideology here, and I think we have to examine these claims. And this, I think, takes me to these reference points, certainly that of Polanyi. I think we do need to ask difficult questions about conventional economics. Again, whether you want to call those Chicago School neoliberal or what have you, I mean, there are different ways of describing that, but clearly what they put at the forefront of everything is the market, and indeed development is often entirely market driven. Sen is interesting as a perspective on this, particularly when he talks about development as freedom. I mean, Sen is not an anti-market thinker in the sense that Amin might be, or even in the sense that certain elements of Polanyi's ideas are, but certainly in talking about ideas of well-being, capacity, raising the question of what people choose to value and linking that question of what people choose to value as to democracy. It's a democratic question, it's a political question, it's a question of how wealth or economic resources are used to benefit most people for the well-being of most people. And I'm hoping you can sense that we get a set of ideas that we can use to think critically about what economies are doing. We might even want to link that to that word justice. Sen certainly does, not in terms of a transcendental idea of justice, which he says people like John Rawls are thinking about. In other words, a massive kind of overarching account of justice. He's more concerned, again, this is a rather approximate expression, in saying that of state of affairs we can move from something that's perhaps labellable as unjust to something that's becomes more just, a kind of slightly more contextual approach then. But I don't want to say too much about that at this point in time. The latter part of the course looks at degrowth thinking. Why do we necessarily consider this idea of growth as a good thing? We need to interrogate those ideas. We look at the role of labour in development, we look at the world of class in development, and we also look at political movements, particularly in South Africa, and notions of things like precarity and political agency. So I've got a couple of questions that I want to deal with quite quickly here. Thank you for your questions. First question, well, it's actually the second question. I'll take it first of all, though. What was the recommended outside of class study hours? It's a good question. It's actually in some ways a very difficult question to answer. The very, very rough rule of thumb I would use or have used is think of the teaching time, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours a week, and then at least double it, and perhaps double it again. That's the baseline. I think it's different for everybody. Obviously, there are seminars and things like that you have to prepare for. There are essays, there are dissertations that you have to prepare for. So you might find there's kind of peaks and troughs as deadlines fall throughout the period of the year, which means that the time in which you are preparing becomes more or less intense. But the thing is, I think it is different for everybody. But I would say that if you've got 4 hours of teaching time, then probably double that is the time that you might want to spend reading. But you also have to account for things like, let's say you get really truly interested by Sen and you drop everything else and you spend a week reading Sen. Well, that happens, and I think it's a good thing that it does happen, all of things being equal, obviously. So there's a rule of thumb, but then we have to have real world variations in that rule of thumb. The other thing that I'm just asked to talk about here, thank you for saying it's very interesting, thank you for that. The intensive course. The intensive course is the same content but delivered in a different way. So I've described the two-term, the structure of the course over terms. The way the intensive course works is to do it in intensive bursts, if you like, which normally I think up to 3 or 4 or 5 days. I can send you more details if you like. Over the course of the year, although I think there's a grouping of the teaching of the intensive course kind of early summer, May, June, July, although it tends to change a little bit from year to year. In other words, your teaching time is compressed. I think that's why it's called an intensive term. An intensive course. It suits some people. Clearly, if you're in London and if your life is such that it might be a better way of doing it. I think it's just there are different modes of delivery. I think that's the fundamental idea. An intensive course is simply taught more intensively. Are there any more questions as yet? I'm not sure. I could say okay, I think we're getting okay. I'm getting my editor here is saying that I've got to conclude. Let me just say thank you very much for listening this evening. Thanks for your time. Drop us a line if you need any more information or you want to discuss any of these things further. And let me just wish you good luck, and I hope you find an LLM that you find really engaging. All the best. Thank you.